Super quick reminder as you guys go ahead and file and make a copy of those notes pages. A couple of things that you need to be aware of. First off, don't forget that your Unit 2 Quiz 2 is due today. That was already an extension from Wednesday. All of you can go ahead and see on your Canvas page. I sent everybody who had not submitted it yet already an email, so you should be able to see in your Canvas inbox if you did not do that, because I just sent you an email about it. And then also, and this one I would say we're at like 60% who have done this in this class. The DWP, only about 5 people have done that in that class. Don't forget to take the opportunity to be able to do that today. Don't forget that next Wednesday, so next Wednesday is going to be your exam, both your multiple choice and short answer. We only have 12 people out of 120 who have done that. So next class period, you have a good probably hour to an hour and a half assignment that you're going to need to be able to do. I'm not making it due until the day that we come back from Thanksgiving break, so that's Sunday. So if you need to take that next class period in order to be able to catch up on anything, do your exam, work on your LEQ, I'm fine with that. I've just set aside that day to be able to work on this assignment, which I will talk about at the end of class because it's not going to make any sense until we get to class. So any questions in the chat or anything like that about assignments, expectations, what's going to happen next class? Okay, cool. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump in as quick as possible so that I have enough time. I might be able to get you out early. Normally we do a pretty large assignment on this day, but we're not doing that. We also normally do it over 2 days. I'm just going to do it over 1. But for this roadmap to the Civil War, it is normally a research assignment. So normally everything that you do on this is a research. I'm basically giving you the information. Today is also what I would consider when you look at these notes that you can, and not those ones, these ones, and you can go ahead and write at the top if you would like, that this page, this packet, whatever you want to call it, is probably one of the most important ones that we're going to use in this class the entire year. I would say every single year there's at least an essay on the causes of or effects of the Revolution, and in the same aspect, there's every single year some sort of an essay, a DBQ, whatever it could be, on the causes of the Civil War. This is super, super important, must-know information. And again, make sure that if you're going to star anything, there's certain notes pages that are super important, and this is going to be one of them. So we're going to talk about the causes of the war. Now on this assignment, you are going to need to know the importance of each of these events. So as we go through these, think to yourself, if I were to write a paragraph about why this event was so important, think that in your head, because you're going to need that information for this assignment that you're going to do, this roadmap to the Civil War assignment. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's get started. So today we're going to be covering the causes of the Civil War. Okay, sorry, just checking really quick. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the causes of the Civil War today, and really think about, as we go through this, how did we go from a unified nation to a complete dissolution and a complete difference in our nation as we begin to break apart in only a few short years. Obviously, we had decades and decades and decades. However, in this case, really the major stuff that's going to be massive catalyst is going to be Mexican-American War through 1860. So let's talk about contextualization. So this is at the very, very top of your paper and your notes paper. And let's talk about context. Remember, if you have any questions whatsoever, put them in the group chat. Ask me questions. We had somebody unmute yesterday. That was so exciting. So just feel free to do that at any time that you might need. So, and by the way, if we ever have these documents, that's because normally we do an activity with this, but we're not going to do that today to save all of you guys a little bit of time. So when we talk about, at the very top, by the way, it says like pre-1820. I'm not going to worry so much about pre-1820. That's all really general stuff. I would, and if you printed this out right the second I sent it, this was not at the end of the pre-1820 because I realized I needed to add it when I was working on the PowerPoint later last night. So at the very end of the first paragraph, it should say the Missouri Compromise. If not, you should already know what it is, so you don't need to write all this down, but just make sure you write down Missouri Compromise. And if you want to put next to the Missouri Compromise is the HC. On almost all Civil War essays, they do not begin until the Mexican-American War, which means that the Missouri Compromise is easily one of the best contextualizations that you can use for a Civil War essay. And as a quick reminder of what that said, remember that the Compromise of 1820 basically allowed Maine to come in as a free state, Missouri to come in as a slave. It equaled the balance of power. And then it said any of these territories, south of the line is going to become state or free, slave. And then anything above that line is going to become a free state. And this was that patchwork. Remember, that's by Henry Clay. This is that Band-Aid that's going to go over the issues that are going on. So let's talk about, again, slavery in the early to mid-1800s. All of this is stuff that you should know. And you can go ahead, and for most of this, you can put this as HC. A lot of this is going to be historical contextualization. And the ones that I would say are the best contextualization are probably going to be the Black Belt. That's a really good HC if you want to write next to that. Remember, this is a good HC as well. It's just it's a little bit less likely that you'll see it on the exam in terms of writing it on the exam, because most of you will probably forget about it, is that they began to move to better non-depleted soil. Remember, they overproduced their cotton crop. The North begins to have a lot of free labor compared to the South's dependence on slave labor. We'll talk about this Underground Railroad a little bit later. Remember with the slave revolts, we talked about how most of the successful revolts were really small revolts, really small in plantation, small things like working slower, accidentally breaking tools, whatever it could possibly be. In this case, though, there were two rebellions that are considered the most successful slave rebellions. The Prosser Rebellion, you can put next to the Prosser Rebellion. We've actually already talked about that. That is the one, remember, we talked about in Virginia, how there was that rebellion, and then they did that mass execution, and then now it's like, and then they were building the baseball stadium. Hopefully you guys remember that. That was the Prosser Rebellion. And then Nat Turner's Rebellion is one that we didn't talk about. Nat Turner's Rebellion is when he got a massive amount of slaves that uprose. It was quite successful. It really disrupted things. Pretty much everybody died except Nat Turner. He actually hid for 55 days to survive. However, it massively changed laws in the South, where now it made it, for example, in his state, they made it illegal to educate slaves, for example. So I would say it made the biggest impact, but just keep in mind, I would highlight Nat Turner. He's commonly used a lot. Just know that while Nat Turner did do a lot in terms of the impact, he was not necessarily successful in terms of stopping slavery. We've talked about white abolitionists before. If you want to highlight William Lloyd Garrison, and then Frederick Douglass, those are the two most popular abolitionists that you're going to see. A lot of this was newspapers that they wrote attempting to convince people. And one thing I really want to emphasize, though, is they really wanted, if you want to highlight in this last bullet, a legal end to slavery. It wasn't about rebelling. It wasn't about a war. It wasn't about having all these things. They wanted just to legalize the ability to ban slavery. So that's an important thing to be able to remember. And this was really based on the idea that it was immoral. It wasn't necessarily based on the idea that, you know, it's bad for the economy, we should have different immigrants. Instead, most of it was that slavery was just immoral. So all of this is going to be your HC, but really when we begin, and there's Nat Turner's Rebellion. I forgot that we had that. So again, probably one of the most popular things that you'll see as a sourcing possibly is what's called the Liberator. So if you want to go ahead and highlight the Liberator with William Lloyd Garrison, that was a major newspaper that was going to advocate for banning slavery and things like that in the North. Sorry, we have lots of people coming in, so I keep having to switch back and forth. Now let's go through the types of abolitionists. So there's three major types of abolitionists that you're going to see when we talk about categorization. The first is going to be what's called a radical abolitionist. And a radical abolitionist is somebody who believes that slavery was the greatest evil in the world and must be stopped completely. Now, when we look at the word radical, we're not talking about necessarily radicalism as in what we view radical today. Radical abolitionist is just the idea it must be stopped, it must be ended. These are going to be your massive advocates for this. So you could consider probably Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison one of these. They're not super radical. We'll talk about a guy later that's especially radical in today's verbiage. We also have what are known as free soilers, and I would highlight that because we've talked about that before, but I want to emphasize it again. Free soilers were people who were fine with slavery as long as it did not extend into the new territories. Remember, Free Soil, that was a political party that is going to believe that. And then finally, this was a little bit different, was free labor. And if you want to put next to this free labor, you can put next to this immigrants, as well as factory workers. The idea of the free labor abolitionists is the idea that slavery threatens the sanctity of work. And the concern would be of this is that the more we increase slavery, work ethic goes down, quality goes down. It's much more of an economic than any of these other ones as well. Now, when we talk about the attempts to be able to go into causes of the war and things like that, one of the causes, and I believe I labeled them on your paper, you'll see it says like cause 1, cause 2, cause 3, cause 4, different things like that. Those are the must-know steps. So when we talk about steps to the war, that is really, really important. Now, the Wilmot Proviso and just in general the Mexican-American War is really going to be one of the first causes. And if you want to draw a line above the Mexican-American War and you can put underneath that, everything below is the most common things you're going to see on a Causes of the Civil War essay. Vast majority of the time, and you can put a date next to this, which I actually think it actually is going to be 1846. 1845 to 46 is going to be when the Mexican-American War happens, and that's, again, usually the first debates. And really what you need to know about the Mexican-American War and why it would have caused the Civil War is going to be over what should happen with slavery in the territories. And if you want to write that down, highlight it, I don't remember how I wrote it. But you need to know that it came with debates over slavery. So remember, after the Mexican-American War, we gain all of these territories in the Mexican cession. So the real question becomes, what should happen with slavery? We obviously have this little line right here that's going to go across, but then they started to realize places like Arizona and New Mexico were not good for slavery. So why is it that I should be confined to this area because of the Missouri Compromise and not go into areas where slavery could possibly be more beneficial? And then you have the Free Soilers who said, no, you agreed to this. We agreed to the Missouri Compromise. You can't just begin to extend that line. You must keep the line and have the North be free and the South be slave. I do think part of the reason that this also made people so angry is that, remember, the guy we talked about before, Nicholas Trist, did not gain the territory America wanted. America wanted all of Latin America, and we only took it to the Rio Grande. And so I think that because of that, they thought they were going to make all this area slavery, and that they couldn't because it ended at the Rio Grande. So when we talk about one of the bigger causes, I would star Wilmot Proviso. It's a really great one that attempted to be able to solve the problem of what happened in these territories. So the Wilmot Proviso is going to be kind of what sparks the concern of people saying, wait, are you possibly going to take my slaves away when it comes to slavery in the territories? So remember, we acquire Texas, and basically what happens is once we acquire Texas, there's going to be a rule that he's going to pass. He's going to introduce it into the Senate in an attempt to pass this law. And basically what it says, if you want to highlight, is that it prohibited slavery in any territory acquired by Mexico. So again, highlighting prohibited slavery in any territory acquired by Mexico. And so the idea was that this would solve the problem, right? This is a very much, if you want to write above, this is a free soiler. And Wilmot, who is going to be the guy that creates this, was a free soiler. He didn't want slavery in those territories. But it's important to know that the Wilmot Proviso was never actually passed. In fact, it died very quickly in the Senate. It did not have the amount of support to be able to be necessary. However, the reality is that it began to, if you want to highlight, this is the, and you can write above this, effect, is that it began to divide politics over the issue of slavery, particularly of what's going to happen in the West. You know, had the Mexican-American War not happened, had the Texas Revolution not happened, would we have had the Civil War? I think we would have eventually had the Civil War at some point, but I think what really was the catalyst of starting these concerns, and you can put that next to this cause, the Mexican-American War is what starts the causes. This is what really provides the catalyst of going into banning of slavery and abolition. Now, immediately after this, we're going to have the creation of the new Republican Party, and you're going to go ahead and start this. You really just need to know the word Republican. The new Republican Party, what I mean by that is we already had a Republican Party. It is reformed into the Republican Party. And when we talk about this is where people say, is this the regular Democrats and Republicans? No, this is still the flipped. So Republicans, you can go ahead, and I think it's on the third bullet. The Republicans are mostly going to be anti-slavery and from the North, and they're going to mostly be comprised of, if you want to highlight, the Whigs, the Free Soil Party, and anti-slavery Democrats. And really what they were focusing on was the issue of slavery, anti-immigration, which was a concern because it jeopardized the worth of work as well as the availability of work in the North, and began to create very sectionalist. Now, if you want to write in the margins next to the new Republican Party is the word sectionalism, sectionalism. Sectionalism is the idea of separating based on region. So when we think of us in Olympus, we've sectionalized ourselves, right? We consider us the Skyline. We're a more liberal school. We tend to have a higher LGBTQ population because of that. We tend to lean more Democrat with a lot of our student body. We are sectionalist versus Olympus, which has the same demographic as us in terms of wealth, and yet they tend to be more conservative. They can't talk about a lot of things that we talk about here at Skyline, whether that's good or bad. They also tend to lean more conservative, different things like that. And so when we talk about that sectionalism, we're talking about the separation and the segregation. And we're very secular. I shouldn't say segregation. What I mean by segregation is the separation of parties, not segregation as in African American rights. We see this sectionalism a lot of times today. So for example, if you have turned on the TV to any sort of politics in the last 2 weeks, we are very, very sectionalist. And yes, this lecture is being recorded right now. I don't know if you guys can see the little button right here, but it's being recorded right now. But anyways, and so the sectionalism, when we talk about sectionalism, we talk about the separation between Republican and Democrat, and it really sectionalism, and you can write next to sectionalist, divide. It divides it on the issue of slavery for the most part. Now the Whigs, remember this is going to be Henry Clay's party, it begins to collapse due to pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions. You can also write next to this at the Whig Party, which is similar to the Federalists of why it died. The Whig Party dies because Henry Clay died. Their most likely candidate for president is going to die in a couple of years. And really just this issue of slavery completely destroys this. And because of this, they abandon the party, and most either go into the Republicans, which are the majority of the Whigs, or Democrats who are going to support pro-slavery. Now, if we look at this is obviously getting into these really racist depictions, especially of enslaved peoples or people who are black. Just as a quick reminder, which we have mentioned previously in this class, when we use the word Negro, we will only use it for historical context, so you can see in this one that it's referring to that. A lot of students say, well, it's in a primary source, so I can use it today. That's very inaccurate. That's like using the N-word. Not at the same level of the N-word, but it's a very derogatory term, so we just use it historically, so just keep that in mind. But if you notice, we're going to start to have the very racist tendencies in drawings. So to give you some perspective, for example, is that you have, if you notice this hair right here, there's a big stereotype about African American hair. This is why if you ever watch the movie Zootopia, I can't remember if we talked about this before in this class, but if you watch Zootopia, there's a scene where the sheep, who's the mayor's assistant or whatever, is typing on a computer, and the fox wants to keep touching the wool, and he keeps wanting to touch her hair over and over and over again. And then Judy Hopps, who's the bunny, or I shouldn't say bunny, because in that movie they consider that offensive. Anyways, so what they go to do is she keeps saying it's not appropriate. If you're a sheep, you can touch another sheep's wool, but if you're not a sheep, you can't touch the wool. And it actually comes down to this hair thing. I know a lot of students of mine who are black have said multiple times that students will try to touch their hair. That's super inappropriate if you've ever tried to do that. Don't ever do that again. That's a super bad bias thing. But anyways, that's what that depiction is showing right here. Also, the traditional depiction, the racist depiction of an enslaved person or somebody who's black will have very puffed up lips. Their eyes and their teeth will typically be very, very white. That's also another stereotype, and typically a scrunched up face. And we will talk about this later of why they do this. But you can notice the Democratic platform is for the white man and the Republican platform is for the Negro. Again, causing that separation between white and black and who accepts each. And that brings us to California. In California, really is what changes everything. So you can put this next to the Mexican-American War or somewhere around here, but California is what changes everything. Because California, remember, and you can put next to California the word it's HC, California, remember, has the gold rush. So California wasn't a big deal until everybody moved to California due to the gold rush. You also have this massive population, and now California wants to become a state. Well, this is a pretty big problem considering the fact that California has an issue because California is on that compromise. So remember, we have Henry Clay, and Henry Clay, our wonderful, great compromiser, who's going to try to band-aid our problems. Well, Henry Clay is going to fight for compromise while his rival in the Senate and the House, John C. Calhoun, which we've talked about before, they're going to fight over this issue of slavery, of whether or not California should or should not be accepted as a slave state or as possibly a free state. And this debate over California gets extremely heated. People are constantly threatening secession. Calhoun threatened secession constantly over time. Henry Clay said we need to compromise. People were getting into fights. It was, a whole mess on the Senate floor when it comes to California. So remember, did they love each other? Absolutely not. They despised each other. Each of them hated each other. Calhoun hated Henry Clay way more. He said actually that he was one of the worst men he has ever met or will ever meet in his lifetime. Absolutely hated each other, but they did eventually agree to a compromise. And of course, who's going to create that compromise is our wonderful Henry Clay. So Henry Clay is going to create compromise, and this compromise is called the Compromise of 1850. Now, this is a double-starred term. It is one of the most important. It is a must-know. You need to especially know the difference between the two compromises. Now, the Compromise of 1850, and you can put this underneath, really attempted to prevent secession of the South. It wasn't necessarily to solve the slavery issue. In fact, it was actually pretty pro-South, but it was specifically to solve the problem when it comes to slavery. So basically what happens is you end up creating all of these different territories, and the Compromise of 1850 does the following. So first off, you do need to know that it is regional. The Northern Whigs, and eventually this becomes the Republicans, and the Southern Democrats had extremely different views on slavery and how it should be able to be handled. So Henry Clay is going to pass this. He's going to introduce this. This is his final major compromise before he dies. And if you want to go ahead and bracket the Fugitive Slave Act down to popular sovereignty, this is what it's going to actually pass. So first off, before I move on, the slave trade in D.C. is going to be abolished. This was still something that was legal, but this is actually a slave trade that's a domestic slave trade. It admitted California as a free state. A couple years ago on Jeopardy, there was a question that said, what was the southernmost slave of the Union? And nobody got it right, but the correct answer is California. California was a Union state when we go into the Civil War. Popular sovereignty, we're going to especially talk about this in a moment, as well as the Fugitive Slave Act, and it did stall the Civil Wars. And while this tried to reach a compromise, make everybody happy, it was just a Band-Aid. We were bleeding out at this point, and very, very temporarily is it going to solve the problems of America. Now, this is one of my favorite cartoons because it's a really great representation of this compromise. Notice it says this congressional scale is a true balance. So what you're seeing in this right here is you're seeing the president, and then you're seeing on both sides that you are attempting to be able to have this compromise. Henry Clay is right here on the left. John C. Calhoun is on the right. And you're trying to create a perfect compromise. And again, eventually these scales are going to tip. It's no way to make it a perfect scale. Now, Millard Fillmore, who's the president at this time, he actually declares that this was the final settlement of North and South tensions. Obviously, we know that this is false. Interesting fact as well about Millard Fillmore, that if you just want to write this down as a great remembrance, Millard Fillmore, do you guys remember that Know Nothing Party that we talked about last class period? Millard Fillmore was a president who was elected on the Know Nothing Party. He was our president. He was very clear that he hated immigrants. He created multiple laws that restricted immigrants, but we did elect a Know Nothing president. Interesting fact as well, the original capital of Utah was Fillmore, Utah, which was named after Millard Fillmore. And you can go there and they have like a plaques and stuff like that. Anyways, that's Millard Fillmore. So let's get to John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. Remember, these are people who keep bringing up the issue of secession and keep bringing up the issue of compromise and trying to solve those problems. Well, John C. Calhoun dies, and then a year later, Henry Clay dies. And really this signals the end to any sort of compromise, because while they hated each other, they were willing to compromise and stop secession. Once both of them die, the North no longer has a compromiser, and John C. Calhoun, who was a pretty radical guy, is no longer present to solve the issues of the South. So let's talk about this impact of the Compromise of 1850, and we'll start with the Fugitive Slave Act. I would highlight this. This one's really important because of its impact, and it attempted to be able to please the South and make it happy. And basically what it allowed is that federal agents would be able to track runaways and require different authorities in the North to assist Southern slave catchers. So basically what this required is that if a slave escaped from the North, you are required by law to return their slave to the slave master. And the problem with this is that this really created an issue where the North began to have this massive pushback. And the Underground Railroad, if you want to go ahead and highlight that, the Underground Railroad originally starts in the 1830s, but what really begins to change things, though, is that what changes is with this Fugitive Slave Act, the Northerners use this as a way to fight back against slavery. And so the Underground Railroad, which was basically this connection and interweaving of these hidden trails, people assisting people, was smuggling into the North to be able to get them into the free North. However, remember, even if you go to the North in the Underground Slave Trade, or slave railroad, you are required by law to return them. And so people were arrested for harboring these. If you guys remember, we talked about Burns, who was the guy in the Lumpkin slave jail that escaped to the North and was brought back to the South. He was a person who was captured under the Fugitive Slave Act. And the reason why they justified this escaping, it wasn't justified as, well, we're fighting back. It was justified as, even if you are enslaved, you have inalienable guaranteed rights by the Constitution, and one of those is the right to escape and the right to be able to go to the North and gain freedom. Now, if you notice in this poster, so these are the runaway slave posters, which are usually the most popular way to be able to see the Fugitive Slave Act. I just want to point out this $150 reward. That's thousands of dollars that they're trying to get for this single slave to be returned to their original slave master. And so this fugitive slave law really attempted to be able to get these people back. And if you notice, this is attempting to see how it says, which disregards all the ordinary securities of personal liberty, which tramples on the Constitution. So it really wasn't necessarily slave versus anti-slave. A lot of this was really focused on whether or not this was constitutional to take away these rights. And so you can see right here, families who escaped. It didn't matter, like Robert Burns, for example, he was in the North for, I think, 15 years when he was returned from the Fugitive Slave Act. That allowed them to be able to recapture them. But really what you're starting to see with this fugitive slave law is people running, escaping, and these images get created to try to advocate for abolition. And there's Anthony Burns, which we talked about, not Robert Burns, Anthony Burns was the guy I was meaning, that was the guy in that Lumpkin slave jail that we talked about before. To give you some perspective of kind of the danger that this brought people into, so this is Margaret Garner. She was a runaway slave. She had 7 children. And what happened is that when they came in to get Margaret Garner and bring her back to the South, they killed her husband, and she said she didn't want to put her kids into slavery, and so she ended up killing all of her family with a hatchet, and then killing herself rather than going to the South and becoming enslaved once again. Now, one thing that you'll notice in these political cartoons is you'll notice a lot of times the slave catchers will be done as dogs. That's what you're seeing right here, is you're seeing the slave catchers being depicted as that. And again, when we look at this Canada, Canada did not have slavery. It was owned by Britain. So in theory, if you make it into Canada, you would not... if you made it into Canada, you could not be returned because the Fugitive Slave Act doesn't apply to that. So this is the past of the Underground Railroad. You'll notice that most of these locations are attempting to get into either Canada or Mexico. It was much more successful if you were able to get into Canada, which is why there was actually a pretty large black population in this area of Canada. We talked about that before. So what they would do, by the way, is they would have stations. So how it would work is along this Underground Railroad, you would basically have handlers that would move you from station to station. It would be underground, literally. It could be in boats. You could be smuggled in. Think of this as just smuggling people into the North or into Canada. The most famous of this is Harriet Tubman, who is going to be a massive, what they would call a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So you can see this, though, is that this is trying to say that this is wrong. You're just breaking the law. You're purposely breaking the law. So you can see it says, what is the difference between a Yankee violating the fugitive slave law in the North and a Southern man violating the law against the African slave trade in the South? Trying to justify the slave trade first and being able to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. So this is what you're seeing in this. So you can see the Fugitive Slave Law right here. Interesting fact, this is William Lloyd Garrison. That you can see, and then this is a black woman as well as a black male attempting to defend. You have this Temple of Liberty, that's kind of the contrasting here. You can see people are dying right here. You see that people are coming in from the South to try to take them back with that Fugitive Slave Act. So now let's head into one of my favorite women who really made a difference, and in fact, she was considered as one of the biggest catalysts for the abolitionist movement, and this is a lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, some of you did Catherine Beecher on your reformer assignment. This is her sister. The whole Beecher family was very abolitionist, advocating for women's rights, as well as children's rights. So Harriet Beecher Stowe wants to explain the horrors of slavery. She actually grew up in the South. She saw the issues of slavery until they became converted. Her father became a preacher in the North, and she began to go out against slavery and abolition. And so this is a phrase by her. So it says, the time has come when even a woman or a child who can speak a word for freedom and humanity is bound to speak. So she wanted to be able to speak her knowledge and be able to really advocate for abolition. And so she is going to publish this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. I would double star this. This is really what is advocated for by most as one of the biggest catalysts for the causes of the Civil War. And basically what Uncle Tom's Cabin is all about is you have Uncle Tom, that's him in this picture. And Uncle Tom is a slave, and basically what he's doing is he is recanting his story. He's a runaway slave, and he's telling his story to kids about his life, and it's very violent, it is very graphic, and it's all real. It's all real things that happened. And for a lot of people, this was the first time they saw the horrors of slavery. They couldn't believe this was something that was actually happening in the world. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe was absolutely hated by the South. People attempted to kill her and different things like that. Interesting fact, by the way, about Uncle Tom's Cabin is that when the Civil War began, Abraham Lincoln invited her to his home, and while they were having dinner, the famous phrase that allegedly was said was, "So you must be the little old lady who started this great big war." Because a lot of people felt like this is what rallied the cause of the North. Had it not been for her book, I don't know if the North would have been as anti-slavery or as encouraged to be able to go into the Civil War. Now you can see right here, you can see this Uncle Tom's Cabin, portrayed those anti-slavery values. England, by the way, this is really important if you want to start the second bullet. When the war begins, England does not ally with the South, which they should have, because they were so dependent on Southern cotton, but they didn't because too many people were anti-slavery due to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And again, the Southerners begin to rationalize slavery while the Northerners begin to feel like this was their first major view on slavery. So let's talk about, again, moving into the West. So really this westward migration is a major reason of why these things occur. Because as we move more and more west, now what are we going to do with all these other territories? How are we going to be able to add them in? Now let's think about the Compromise of 1850. One of the rules of the Compromise of 1850 was that when a state would come into the Union, they would decide on the slavery issue with popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty, who was created by Stephen Douglas, popular sovereignty is the idea that territorial residents are going to be the ones who vote and decide the status of whether free or slave states in any new state. So again, the residents, not Congress and the federal government, is going to decide this. Now, this wasn't that bad of an idea, and I'm not saying slavery is good or bad. It's obviously bad. But what I'm saying is it kind of makes a little bit of sense. So, for example, legalization of marijuana. If you want to be able to decide that, maybe have the people vote on this and allow it to happen or not. Or maybe we should be doing this with things like Obamacare, maybe. Decide on if we want Obamacare or not. Don't let Congress decide. Do a vote like we do for the president. Now, this is not going to happen at that kind of a level, but I'm just trying to make you think. Popular sovereignty, which we still do have today in the fact that we vote for different rules and amendments, but should you be using this voting to decide on slavery? Now, Stephen Douglas thought this was a great idea, right? Why don't we let the people of the state decide? What they weren't expecting is what is called Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas comes from the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So if you want to put the HC is Manifest Destiny. So again, the movement west, you can do the Mexican cession, gaining these territories, increase of movement through like the Oregon Trail, the Californian Trail. And again, the issue of, if you want to put the biggest HC of this, is the Compromise of 1850 of popular sovereignty. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is passed by Congress, says that the Kansas and Nebraska territories are created, but the question of slavery is going to open to the local residents. Well, unfortunately, this was one of the worst decisions in American history, because what they weren't expecting is that both sides of the argument would do any means necessary to get rid of or pass slavery. So let's talk about Kansas. So Kansas becomes what is known as Bleeding Kansas. And when we talk about bleeding, we really do mean Bleeding Kansas. Because Kansas is going to be one of the biggest issues that can't decide if it's going to be free or slave. Nebraska votes it pretty easily, but Kansas is prime soil content for the use of slavery. So what happens is, so you can see right here, so this would be created by somebody who's a free soiler or an abolitionist. You can see this person, this free soiler, they're attempting to force slavery down this throat. You can see that he is being murdered right here. You can see that Kansas is here. So the idea of your people move to these areas, but you're forcing slavery down it by being able to do popular sovereignty. Now, when they go to do this, they did try to stop the violence, and one of the ways they stopped the violence or attempted to stop the violence was through what was called the Lecompton Constitution. And the Lecompton Constitution was where they passed a law that said that you could not constitutionally ban slavery, and also put several things in the state constitution that allowed the expansion of slavery. Now, in theory, this solves the issue, right? You can't vote if it's already law. However, what they weren't expecting, again, was all of that violence, and that's where it brings to what is called Bleeding Kansas. Now, Bleeding Kansas was the massive violence between pro- and anti-slavery forces. There were no requirements at this time to have lived in a specific area for a length of time in order to be considered a resident. Because of this, people from all over the nation came to Kansas and attempted to vote, or at least sway the vote in some way to have that popular sovereignty. Anybody who went across the border, by the way, to vote, even though they weren't a citizen of that state, if you want to go ahead and highlight, was border ruffians, which was the idea of moving across and especially intimidating. And it was rough. You would show up to the ballot box and people would point a gun at your head and say, you're going to vote pro or anti, and this is how it's going to be. People were murdering each other. People were doing anything necessary, burning houses down of people who voted for or against slavery, depending on their views. And it just became mass chaos in Kansas, one of the worst riots, and I wouldn't even call it a riot, I would call it anarchy in American history. And then we get to this guy named John Brown, and I love John Brown. We're going to talk about him twice today. This is probably the most famous image of John Brown. John Brown I wouldn't call him a minister or a preacher. I would say instead that John Brown was a very religious man who was very convinced that God wanted to ban slavery. And because of this, he became a radical abolitionist. And you can put next to that with John Brown, he was radical. He was willing to do anything that was necessary to stop slavery. And if you notice right here, you have the Confederates on the one side. This is the Dixie flag. You can see that this is all burning and in turmoil. Over here, you have the abolitionist side, the Union. You have it in turmoil as well. As you have this is really indicative. This is why of Kansas. This is why in The Wizard of Oz they have all these tornadoes, because it's in Tornado Alley. Excuse me. An interesting fact, by the way, in order to be able to help out John Brown and all these different radical abolitionists that came in, you had Henry Ward Beecher, who again is the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe and Catherine Beecher. And what happened is that, or not Harriet Beecher Stowe, excuse me, mixed that up, my problem. But what basically happened with Henry Ward Beecher is that he is going to send all these Bibles to to Kansas in an attempt to be able to convert and help with religion. Well, he wrote on the box it was a Bible, but it was actually a gun, and they called these Beecher's Bibles, so churches would get all these Bibles from Henry Ward Beecher, acquire it, take the gun, and then would end up going and using it in this battle. Now, John Brown is easily the most violent of all the abolitionists. He was willing to do anything necessary, including die himself, in order to be able to make a statement. When he went to, and this is what kind of made him start to be famous, is he went to Kansas, he found a family who had voted for slavery, He chopped them into little pieces, burnt them, and then threw them into the river nearby, and he did that about 4 times in Kansas, with killing about 30 to 40 people. So very violent, but very much a radical abolitionist. And people loved John Brown, by the way. Abolitionists loved him because he was willing to do what was necessary in order to do that. So you can see that this is from somebody who's a border ruffian from the South. So it says the Southern opinion upon the subject of slavery is now the supreme law of the land, meaning that slavery runs America. So when we go to look into the impact of this is a really, really famous political cartoon, but it's a little bit confusing, so hopefully I can help you out with this. So you have this guy named Charles Sumner. He's from Massachusetts. He's an abolitionist. And Charles Sumner is very upset about what is happening in Kansas during Bleeding Kansas. And so Charles Sumner goes in front of the Senate, and he is going to massively yell and scream and get into this really bad fight with this guy named Andrew Pickens Butler. He was from North Carolina. And they have this massive fight in the Senate, and they are furious at each other. They're screaming at each other. They're throwing things at each other, and then they go away. Well, Preston Brooks, who is this guy, he is the nephew of Andrew Pickens Butler, and he feels like Charles Sumner has dishonored his family. So they're not going to duel, though, because they're going to do something a lot more violent. So what happens is that they're going to go onto the Senate floor, and at this time, it was kind of weird. There was no rolly chairs back there, so instead what they had is all the chairs were kind of on this like system of, I can't remember the name, this sliding system where you could pull the chair back and forth, but it was on these like little rows. So Charles Sumner was sitting there in the middle of the Senate. Andrew Pickens Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, goes to Charles Sumner. He walks up to him while he is sitting in this thing. He puts his foot on the back of the chair and begins massively attacking him with a cane. He began to attack him so much, Charles Sumner attempted to get away. He tried to hide under his desk because he couldn't scoot back because it was stuck. And he continued to beat him over and over again. Preston Brooks eventually beat him so much that his cane splintered into about 100 pieces. When it splintered, though, he grabbed the end, and he ended up, this is actually his original cane, which you can actually go and view. It's at a museum, and I think it's North Carolina. And then he was beating him so badly that he took the cane again and began to beat him with the gold area. He was beaten so badly that he was beat unconscious, and he was unconscious for about 25 minutes while he continued to be beaten. If you say, well, what happened after that? These people, if you notice how nobody's doing anything, you can actually see this guy right here is blocking people. They considered this a duel, the people who were watching this. So they said, let them be, let them be, let them fight it out. Well, what they didn't realize is that Charles Sumner was beaten so badly that he was, in today's word, to be hospitalized, but he was put on bed rest and not allowed to leave his house for 3 years after this beating and received permanent brain damage because of this beating. And you might say, oh, well, what the heck happened to Preston Brooks? He obviously got in trouble, right? He did not get in trouble. He's actually loved in the South. This is where his cane is at, and they actually, at the place of where this happened, they have a big memorial to him. His cemetery stone, his headstone, is this massive thing as a tribute to him for sowing Southern rights. So this political cartoon is actually a Northern preferred. And this is what's called, by the way, if you need to write this down, the caning of Charles Sumner. That's what the name of this is. And the reason why this is pro-abolition and pro-North, notice it says Southern Chivalry Argument versus the Club. So he has the argument of why Kansas and why this Bleeding Kansas is such a problem. And yet you have the club. So instead of having a well-formed argument, you're just going to beat people up. And so this is very much an abolitionist political cartoon. And then we go to one of the worst decisions in American history. I would star this one. It's very important. I think you also need to know this for AP Gov, if you're an AP Gov student. And this has to do with this guy named Dred Scott. So Dred Scott, who's this guy right here, he was a slave in the South. And when he was a slave in the South, he had a slave master. And his slave master wanted to go on a trip. So they're going to go on a trip all throughout the North. But remember, he is a slave. And when he goes into this, so you can see they start to go into this. They begin to move through here, and he goes to all these different spots. And notice that he stops in 3 different locations, and all 3 of these different locations are going to be places. So he starts here, but he goes here, here, and here. And these 2 locations are both ones where he has rights and is free, and this one he doesn't. So in multiple places, there was either banned slavery or there's accepting of slavery. Well, the problem is that what happens is he makes it all the way up into the north, and then his master dies. Well, then he says, I am in a free area, therefore I am a free slave. And what happens is the widow of the slave master sues, saying that he is a slave and needs to go back to being enslaved. However, it goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and one of the worst decisions in American history is going to happen. Now, this is your time to be in the chat, because there was this guy. We've talked about him before. I told you to remember him and that he was going to come up later. This is Roger B. Taney. He looks like death. Can anybody put into the chat where we know him from? I told you to remember. We know him. Anybody want to put in the chat? Be brave. This is my very quiet class. Do you guys remember the bank war? And how, there we go. I got one person right when I said it, good. So we have the bank war. Remember, Taney was put in charge as the Secretary of Treasury. He was responsible for destroying the National Bank from Andrew Jackson. That's the same guy. So as reward for destroying the National Bank, Roger B. Taney is made the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And because of that, he makes one of the worst decisions in American history. And here's what it means. So these, I would bracket and star. These are must know for the AP exam. Here's what they said. As a black man, he has no rights. Therefore, he has no right to sue because he's not a citizen. Oh, and by the way, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, which means Congress can't prohibit slavery in the territories. So these two are based on the actual case itself, and then he throws in here that there's no more Missouri Compromise and it is now considered unconstitutional. And I actually had some changes here. So what happened is that basically, again, he wanted to be able to get his freedom, but again, the biggest thing of this is overturning this Missouri Compromise and that you can't prohibit territory in the territories. And I apologize for this being highlighted. This was something I added and I forgot to unhighlight it, so this was my fault. So here's what the impact is. This basically means that enslaved people were property and they did not have any sort of constitutional claims over citizenship. It overturned any law that had banned expansion of slavery in the territories, and now slavery can be in any place in the United States. And this was a massive turning point because now all of a sudden you can now have slavery wherever you want, and nothing that the government does can be able to prevent that. So very, very influential. Now, you might occasionally see them throw in economics, for example. So they might throw in there of why they did this. It's a less common example, which is why I didn't make it a major cause. A lot of people said that the North and the South were becoming more separated. The North was beginning to do internal improvements, while the South went and focused on England. They felt like the North was getting too much beneficial economic treatment. But again, you're at least likely to see this. Now, one of the common things if you want to put next to economy is I would write down this phrase. It's extremely common. This is really commonly used as a justification, and it's a justification of whether or not, not whether or not, but it's a justification that says you're just as bad in the North as we are in the South. So you can see it says Lords of the Lash and Lords of the Loom. Loom is that textile mills. So it's just saying you're exactly the same as me in terms of the fact that you are just as bad. And if you think about it with internal improvements, there was easily preference to the North. And so a lot of this said, why is the North having so much beneficial economic treatment compared to the South? Now, again, you can throw this in an essay. I wouldn't say it's the most important, but you do have to think beyond just slavery when it comes to this war. Now, we also had a massive panic in 1857. There was bank closures, credit panics, things like this. So there was also some concerns, especially as the South became very stable because they relied on England, was again that sexualism. And then we go into the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So you have Lincoln over here on the right, and then you have Stephen Douglas on the left. Stephen Douglas, remember, is the guy who creates popular sovereignty. They are both competing for the same seats in the legislature. This is not a presidential election. They are both speaking, and it almost would be like, two governors arguing about issues here in America or in Utah in a debate. It wasn't a big deal until it really solidified the two of their views on the issue of slavery. So the whole issue of this is they were trying to argue, they were trying to win the seat. And what happened is that they began to argue about things like popular sovereignty, which Douglas had created. And Douglas wins these debates, but this really solidifies, and what you need to know for the Lincoln-Douglas debates, this solidified or made clear Lincoln's views on slavery. That's really the biggest thing that happens here. This is also the phrase where he gets into this, a house divided itself cannot against itself cannot stand. You've probably heard of that phrase before. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. So what he's trying to say this is, you can't be divided. We can't live as a country like that, and we will instead fall apart to civil war. Stephen Douglas disagreed. He said, why can it not exist divided into free and slave states? Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, and the great men of that day, made this government divided into free states and slave states and left each state perfectly free to do as it pleased. So you can see that they very much disagreed. Stephen Douglas was very much let people do what they need to do versus the South, or versus Lincoln, who very much disagreed. And Lincoln, you have to remember with Lincoln, his major focus was not anti-slavery, it was preservation of the Union. He wasn't necessarily anti-slavery. He does become this later. I think a lot of people, when they think of Abraham Lincoln, they're like, oh, he was the freer of the slaves. He loved slaves. He wanted to be able to help them. He was preserving the Union, not trying to save slaves. Slaves is going to become later as a war tactic. So here's his counterpoints again. It's again not saying he doesn't like the Southern people, but he said specifically he would not immediately abolish slavery, but he would instead support and honor all the South's constitutional rights. He would support the Fugitive Slave Act as long as it didn't punish free slaves that were already free. And again, he really emphasized he did not want perfect social equality. So at this time, it's all about preserving the Union. Oh, and by the way, interesting fact about this, Stephen Douglas did win the seat, but we'll talk about later what Abraham Lincoln wins instead. Now, Frederick Douglass, so let's talk back to John Brown. So Frederick Douglass knows John Brown, and he's worried about John Brown. John Brown is very much a radical. He supports his idea of abolition, but not at the radical state that he is in. And what happens is that basically you have this thing called the Mason-Dixon line that's going to be established. And you can write this next to John Brown. The Mason-Dixon line, basically served as an extension. So you have the Missouri Compromise down here, and they're going to extend this Mason-Dixon line right here in an attempt to be able to establish where slavery could and could not be. Well, the problem is that John Brown didn't think that this was enough. He wanted this line to extend all the way down here and head into Virginia. So what happens is that John Brown is going to go to this place called Harper's Ferry, where he really wants to solidify that the North should go into the South and be able to prevent slavery. And so he tells Frederick Douglass his plan that he is going to do this massive rebellion attack. And you can see that Douglass disagreed with them. He said John's idea would be an attack upon the federal government and would array the whole country against us. They were really concerned that his radicalism would completely twist the tide and make people more and more angry. Well, John Brown doesn't care, because what he's going to do is he's going to rebel. So this is his statement right here. It says, now if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country, and whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, then I say, let it be done. And that's what he did. He attempts to recruit tens of thousands of slaves to do this massive rebellion. He goes to Harper's Ferry in Virginia, and he is going to take over an armory there where there's all the guns. And he waits. The day comes when all the slaves are going to come, and nobody shows up. Out of the 20,000 or so people that he invited, only about 11 to 20 of them actually arrived. So what happens is that the militia shows up, and they begin mass firing on this army. Tons of people, almost everybody pretty much dies. John Brown's own son also dies in Harper's Ferry, and eventually John Brown himself gets arrested. Well, what happened is the reason they were able to arrest him is they actually had set the armory on fire, smoking him out and forcing him to be able to leave. Well, John Brown gets arrested, and he goes on trial, and he's convicted and charged with treason, and he is then sentenced to death. Well, if you notice in here, so you can actually see the people who are black right here. He goes to get executed. And when he goes to get executed, he really is, if you want to put next to John Brown, a martyr. That's really what he became super famous for. They ask him for his last words, and he famously responds and says, "You may dispose of me very easily, but this question is still to be settled. This Negro question, I mean, the end of that is not yet." And then he is hung and killed. Now, John Brown was a martyr, right? He wants to be used as a symbol. And so what happens is that they are going to parade his body around. So actually what they do is they take his body, they put it in a coffin, and they parade it around for 6 months in the north, and people can come and say their respects. Now, because of this, a very famous song was created that people would sing as they saw John Brown's body go down the street. Now, here's the chat again. We're going to listen to this song. You have heard this song, but not the lyrics that you're hearing it. So it's going to sound extremely familiar to most of you. If you know what this song is, please put it in the chat. Let's have a little bit of interaction here. So I'm not just talking to a screen and Helena. So please put it into the chat what this song is, if you've heard of it before. Let me turn on the music. If you can't hear it, put it in the chat that you can't hear it. Once I start the video, I'm going to turn it up mega loud, so hopefully you guys can hear it. Okay. So again, in the chat, what song is this song?
And though he lost his life in his struggle to free the slaves, his truth is...
It should sound familiar. It's not the lyrics, but what is it? You've heard it.
John Brown's body lies molding in the grave. John Brown's body lies molding in the grave. John Brown's body lies molding in the grave, but his truth still marches on.
Okay, who has heard this song? You can even do like a little raise your hand on your chat, or you can put in the chat if you've heard of something that sounds really familiar to this song. I have a couple people that are saying it sounds familiar. Does anybody know the name of the song that you know today? Anybody know what it's called? I'll give you a hint. I forgot to put this into the thing, so that's fine. Anybody heard of a song called Battle Hymn of the Republic? Anybody heard of that song? It's a church song. If you've been to church, I'm sure that you've heard of it before. Let's hear what this song is, because I'm sure you've heard of it before, you just might not recognize it. So let's listen to this song. I'm trying to turn it up for you. Does it sound familiar now? Now you probably have heard of the chorus, so we'll listen to the chorus really quickly. Okay, you guys have heard this song probably before. So many of you guys are just silent right now. It's killing me. Hopefully you've heard of this song before. This is the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which you've probably heard of before because it's a church song. If you are LDS, it's in your hymn books. Almost every Christian...
Attention faculty and staff. The water is going to be turned off for about an hour in just a few minutes. So if you need to use a restroom or get some water, please do so as soon as possible. Thank you.
Okay. So you've probably heard of this song before, which is Battle Hymn of the Republic. So what happens is they have John Brown's body, which is on the left, and this is the lyrics that it has right here. So you can see it has this Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so true. He frightened Virginia. They hung him for a traitor, but his soul goes marching on. And it's all about how John Brown is a complete martyr. Well, as it's going along, there's this lady, and she's listening to this. She's looking out the window, and she sees this song being played, and she's like, wow, that's like a really good song, I should rewrite it. And so she rewrites it into the Battle Hymn of the Republic, using the same exact musical notes and things like that, and she rewrites it, and you can actually see the essence of anti-slavery and abolition when you go to sing this. This was actually one of the most popular Civil War songs that this union would do, so it actually was created specifically as a Civil War song. And you can actually see down here, right here, so it says, in the beauty of the lilies Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. Okay, here's the slavery part. And as he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on. That is specifically referring to, again, looking into that slavery issue. So next time you hear Battle Hymn of the Republic, it was originally a Civil War song, and then now it's been adapted to religion and different things like that. So then we get to really the end and really the solidifying of the separation between the different areas, and that's going to be the election of 1860. This is a double-star term. This is really what is going to be the major difference in terms of starting the war. And so what happens is that we have the election of 1860. So the Republicans, which is going to be Abraham Lincoln, is going to be the major guy of that. And then you're going to have the Democrats of Stephen Douglas. And so you're like, okay, this is just a rematch of what we've already previously talked about. And they do have a rematch. And they absolutely hate and despise each other. And they're going to do this bitter, bitter, bitter fight of who is going to win the presidency. Now, Stephen Douglas was the Democrat. And then you have another Democrat, and John C. Breckinridge. And then you have another Democrat in John Bell. This is where it gets really interesting. You see, there wasn't just two candidates, because back then we didn't have only two candidates and we didn't have these conventions. So instead you had one Republican versus three Democrats who all had a differing opinion on how the war should be. And this political cartoon, which is one of my favorite cartoons, and what this is trying to show you is what each of them believed about what should be done. So notice the America is being torn apart, right? In particular, you're going to see Lincoln and Stephen Douglas over here. So you have Lincoln and Douglas, they're especially concerned about the territories. What should happen over here with these territories when it comes to slavery? And then over here, you're also going to have Breckinridge. And Breckinridge was from the South, and he was a supporter of slavery, but he was more of a supporter of let's compromise, let's band-aid everything. And then you also have Bell as well, and Bell believed in the same thing. Let's just patch things back together and be able to solve the issues. So really, while it becomes Lincoln and Douglas who are the main characters here, Breckinridge and Bell make a huge difference because of the end results. So notice that Lincoln wins all of the North. He doesn't win a single electoral vote in the South. And then in the South, you have all of these different Democrats, but here's why it's so important. By the way, notice that Stephen Douglas, who everybody was caring about, barely won any votes. You can actually see right here that he had hardly won any votes at all. Then you had Breckinridge, which was really, really emphasizing Southern slavery, and that Southern slavery should be a constitutional amendment and things like that, won most of the South, which Stephen Douglas wasn't expecting. In fact, he barely campaigned in the South because he thought he would win it easily. And then you had Bell, who was from the Virginia area, that's going to advocate for being able to solve the problems and patch it together. And so you have all these differences. And what you really need to know about the election of 1860 is that this is the breaking point. This is where they decide that they are going to secede. And what happens is that even though, and I think this is like your last bullet, even though the Abraham Lincoln did not win a single Southern electoral vote, he wins because the Democrats split. So all of these people in the South are going to split. So even though if you added up all these Democrat electoral votes, they should have won, but they didn't win because they were so split in the South about what they should do with the issue of slavery, and then Lincoln is going to end up winning here. And when we talk about Lincoln winning this, again, I would make sure to know that he wins the presidency even though he had not won a single election vote in the South. He wins due to the split of the Democratic Party, and he becomes the president. So here's what's going to end up happening, is that we'll get there in just a second. So what happens is immediately is that the South says we are going to secede. They begin to draft articles of secession. They said this is our final straw. We are no longer going to take this. What happens is that Abraham Lincoln does his first inaugural address where he attempts to convince people, stay, don't fight. It's going to be fine. We're going to be okay. We can bring this union back together. But he remained staunch on the issue of slavery. So while he said we can compromise, he said we will not have slavery. So you can see right here it says we are not enemies but friends. We must both be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot gate to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union, focus on the Union, when again touched, and surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. Well, the South was not okay with this, and the South is going to draft and decide that they are going to secede. Now, when they begin to start to draft these, they did attempt to have a little bit of a compromise. So one compromise that you might want to highlight is the Crittenden Compromise. This is where they attempted to constitutionally make it a law that said that slavery must be accepted. However, and then this would also reinstate the Missouri Compromise. So slavery would be in the Constitution and protected, but we would reinstate the compromise. This fails, and the South is going to decide to secede. And we will talk about secession. This will be actually in your project that you're going to do in a couple of days. But just as a quick reminder, not everybody supported secession. A lot of Southerners saw that this was going to be economically disastrous and politically disastrous for the South. Again, this is Lincoln's inaugural address. He said secession was illegal. He was going to assert a federal authority to be able to do that. However, he specifically said he would not interfere or ban slavery in existing territories, and he would enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. So these are his two compromises, and these are his two hard sets. So those are the causes of the war. So let's talk about your assignment, then we'll let you guys go. So on your day by day, you're going to want to look at this roadmap to the Civil War. And we can go ahead and open up this assignment as well. So the roadmap to the Civil War is an activity I started a couple years ago, and of course that year just happened to be the year that there was an LEQ on it, and people really, when they came back and they said, when I asked what is the projects that you enjoyed the most in terms of prepping for you for the exam, and I asked this after the exam to make sure that people, waited until the exam happened, and what happened is that they said this was their favorite. And so it might seem like a good amount of work. However, you can do this in groups of up to 4, and I'll explain if you need to try to find somebody. You can do this in groups of up to 4, and this really is going to be one of the best ways to be able to get the information and kind of synthesize the causes of the war. So here's what's going to happen. Now, luckily for you, I already did this. So when it says research the following 14 most important events, I've already done that for you. You should know by the end of this lesson all of these. So if you look over this list, you should know what each of these means. Okay? And again, you should know what each of these means because we already talked about it. We already did that. So then what you're going to do is you are going to design a something. Now, oftentimes it's a road, and I can show you, there's a couple of examples down here, and I'll show you some examples in a second. But when we talk about the road to the Civil War, we're looking at the causes of the Civil War as a road. What makes it increase and make you go faster? What slowed down the approachment of the Civil War? What really accelerated it? What was a turning point? Think of it in your head as a road. So for example, the Compromise of 1850 tried to slow it down. So maybe it's a yield sign or a stoplight or something to try to slow down the spread. Then you have something like Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that really accelerates it and makes it go faster. You can think of this as speed limits. The Mexican-American War, the speed limit's going like 40, 45. It's kind of quicker, looking into slavery. The Compromise of 1850 slows it down to maybe 20 miles an hour. Then Harriet Beecher Stowe comes around and goes to 70. So think of these as kind of a little bit of a road. What you're going to do is you are going to create some sort of a road. It doesn't have to be a road. I use the word road because that's what most people do because it's easy for them to think about. A lot of people will do a game board where you have a progression, and then, for example, when you get to the square that says Uncle Tom's Cabin, you get to skip 10 steps. when you get to the square that says Harriet Beecher, that you get to like popular sovereignty, that was an attempt to slow it down a little bit, and so you maybe have you go back 2 spaces, but then Bleeding Kansas makes it go 10 forward. We had a really cool one last year. I love this one. This one was an Eminem one, and so what they did is they said their whole character was like looking in to see how fat you can make. There was like a big M&M, and the whole idea was how big can you make this M&M. And for every step on the road that was an increase, they did a ton of M&Ms, and things that slowed it down, they would take away your M&Ms, and the goal was to see if you could get the most M&Ms at the end. That one was pretty cool. I like that one. You can do a whole bunch of options. I had a couple ones here. So this is a really basic one that you can see. This was actually a student. What they did is they actually did the entire thing in Minecraft. And then what they did is they provided this, which was like little snippets from their Minecraft, and then they had a video that walked you through each of the steps. I'm not a Minecraft-y person, but they really enjoyed this. It did take them a little bit of time, but they said their friends were cool with it, so I guess they made their friends do a project for them, and then they made this. So that's what this is showing, is each of the different Minecraft steps that they did. This was another example. This is just a traditional map of going down the roads. You can see this one was going through America and different things like that. So what are you going to need on this map? Oh, here's a really nice one that they did. And by the way, you can do this digitally. This one's a really popular one, is to do it digitally, using things like Google Drawings. PictoChart, if you've heard of that, is really popular. Google Slide, because Google Slide you can zoom in and do this whole thing on a single slide, is also really popular. You can also make it on a poster. It's kind of up to you of what you want to do. So let's talk about what you're going to do for the assignment. Oops. Let me find it. Oh, I just closed it, I think. Okay. I don't know where it went, but I'll reopen it. So then here's what you're going to do. So you have all these different things, and you're going to design some sort of a road. It depends on how you want to do this. It really doesn't matter. You're just doing a start and an end. Your start should always be pre-Civil War or start, and then your end will be the start of the Civil War. You're going to design an action related to each stop. So we talked about before, maybe it's an increase of speed limit. Maybe it's a road bump or a speed bump. We had one person one time that did Mario Kart. And so what they had is they had, like, you know how you do the banana peels and it slows you down, but then you can hit the little track things, the arrows, and it speeds you up. You can do that as well. We had a girl a few years ago, Mary Ricks. She was really into car racing, and so she designed a racetrack. And the racetrack, when it was a straightaway, was when it was quick, but then when it was a curve, she was not into the racetrack we think of here, but this is like long distance racing, which is popular in Europe. And she would do winds that were really close together when it was slowing it down, and then the straightaways. That was really cool. Think about your passion. I don't care what your passion is. You can do it. I mean, you can literally do anything. You could do a trail in the Uintas. We've had somebody designed a ski resort one time. And you had like the moguls were slowing it down, and then you had the racing, and you know, you can do whatever you want. And then for each one you need an action though. So if you notice this example that I have, notice that they have fugitive slave ads. Their action is you were stopped by the police, they have the wrong person. The Uncle Tom's Cabin, you stopped at a visitor center and found a book to read. A lot of people will do like draw a card. So if you land on a square, you have to draw a card and it'll tell you an action. It kind of depends. This is really a creative project, so it just depends on what you want to do. Then what you're going to do is for each of the different events that you're going to have all these events, so 14 events. And then for each event, you need to have a stop, so something that happens. It should be some sort of a design. Each square or whatever you have should have the name of the event, the date of the event, and 2 to 3 sentences about why it is so important, as well as an action associated with the square that relates to that event in some way. And you can see some of those examples right here where they have this paragraph that talks about how important it is. They have the name and when it happened. You can see it says 1850. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. And then you can see that it has an action right here. If you go back into some of the examples, I added some examples down here that you can see of what people did. It really depends on what you want to do. If you don't do it digitally, just take really clear photos, zoom in. These aren't zoomed in because I don't want you to take them and copy them. So you can kind of decide on however you want to do it. And then it's worth 30 points. So it's worth a pretty substantial amount. The next 2 projects we have are worth a pretty good amount. So one thing is that you can do this in a group. Do know, though, that state law right now says that you cannot meet with any other person outside of your house until Monday of Thanksgiving week, which means it is illegal to meet in person. And I don't want you to meet in person. Please stay safe. So if you are looking for a group, my suggestion would be, and you can be cross-class, so if you want to work with somebody in person versus out of person, you can work with somebody in 3A if you're in 1A, similar to the not-so-typical assignments. It's totally up to you of what you want to do. What you're going to do, though, is that you can communicate with them via Canvas. What my suggestion would be, if you want a really good order, is I would do all of the squares first. So I would get a Google Doc, I would divvy up the responsibilities, you do 4, I do 4, whatever it could be. Write your paragraphs, get the titles, and basically just make the squares, like here. And then once you have those squares, figure out how to put it together, whether it be digitally. Don't do where I'll do all the definitions and you put it together. We don't want that. We still want you to be able to learn and practice. But you can do this however you want. If you want to do it on poster board, we've had some people in the past that were distant that they'll take a poster board and then they'll have a square, and then each person does a square. So if you can imagine, somebody would have done this square and then they just take a picture of all 4 and then submit it. So I have 4 different parts. That works totally fine too. I don't really care. And then if you are still looking for a person because you don't know anybody, I did make this looking for a group roadmap to the Civil War. It is a discussion post. If you are looking for a partner and you don't want to do it alone, you can just say, hey, I'm searching for a partner, and see if you can match with somebody else that is on here. And then all of this is going to be due the Sunday before we return, November 29th. Next class period, you have all of next class period to work. I know most of you will probably do your LEQ instead, which is fine, but just know that I am giving you a full class period to be able to work on this project. It should take about an hour to 2, I would say about an hour to hour and a half to be able to finish this, especially if you're in a group. It should take about an hour. Next Tuesday and Wednesday, we do not have lecture. We actually will not have lecture the rest of the dismissal. Remember that you guys come back the Monday of Thanksgiving week, so I will see B-Day students. I won't see any of you, but you will have Tuesday as a distance day. And remember, don't meet in person. If I get an email from a parent that says you did, I will say this was in the instructions at state law not to do that. There is another project that I'll be introducing next Thursday, Friday. That's a 2-part project that you have 2 full work days to work on it, but just know that it's not a lecture day. And I will explain that. You can also do that in groups too. So if you're wanting to do things in a group, start looking for groups now, because you can do both of these individually or you can do them as a team. Anybody have any questions before we finish up today? Anybody have any questions?